Hi everybody, welcome to a flipped class. This is Mr. Wahlberg. We are in period 7, section 1. Now period 7 is a long unit and we're going to spend quite a long time on it. And just about every APUSH teacher that I know divides this period up into two different pieces, and I think we mostly wish that the College Board did the same. We'll do that here. We'll be conformists on this one and kind of go in the trend because it covers a tremendous amount of ground, some disjointed storylines. If you're looking up at the front of the room and you're seeing what the values are for all the different periods, you can see that how this one is weighted. It's one of the heavier weighted ones, but the times that it covers are such interesting. But let's begin on the times, and I want to point to this picture that gets us started here. This is a painting by an American artist named George Bellows, and it was entitled Cliff Dwellers. And I think it's an interesting title for it. If we were in class, we'd be discussing how, in terms of cliff dwelling, how this appears that there's a verticality to this picture, that as if people are almost in their primeval ways of cavemen living in very primitive conditions, yet in the middle of not primitive conditions. Bellows does some interesting things with art techniques. He uses interesting use of lines and lighting to draw you down into the central scene here of this rambunctious boy. But how the lookers on, the people, like the faces are geared towards the center one. And then once you've found this original picture, then you start to look up at the rest of it, and your lines kind of move you around in the chaotic scene. This style of art is it's part of an urban scene that we would characterize as the Ashcan School. We'll talk more about that in a future class, but the Ashcan School was about gritty urban scenes as a strong, opposite of the idyllic pictures that we were finding in other parts of art history. Here, our agenda for today is we're going to do episode 1 of period 7, part 1. Here we call this the American century, and it's basically where the United States emerges as a major world power. We kind of got into this in our last unit, and I'm sad that we got truncated before we got there, but as the United States was becoming a major world power, it was a slow in phases piece of it. We'll talk through it as we enter modern times. We also call this the modern times because we begin here in the 20th century, and it might be the first time in American history that America kind of looks like it does today. I have this theory that is, if you got into a time machine and you appeared in revolutionary America, it might be a really exciting time, but it was a very different part of time. And you would probably just have a hard time making it, like where you buy clothes, how the bathroom works, what you use for toilet paper, or how you get a drink of water. All of those things will be very complicated until you get to about the 20th century. And here we see the pieces of modernity that come in that you could probably make it. America looks like the America we know. Your homework, should you choose to accept it, is to read chapter 18 and be prepared for the quiz that's scheduled out on the calendar. Let's begin with a review of our objectives. We have 2 objectives. You should be able to explain why the city was a central element for the progressive movement in the United States, and you should be able to assess the ways in which the labor and the women's movements challenged the 19th century American notions of freedom. And we'll begin in Roman numeral number 1. For the first time in American history, farms and cities were growing together. The economy was growing about 85% in the first part of the century. That is a tremendous amount of growth, 85%. That, by any standards, is a brilliant piece of economic growth. And we'll begin with our discussion of agriculture. Agriculture entered what would be kind of remembered as a golden age for American agriculture. There was growing cities, which meant there was increasing demand for farm products. And it was coming with a time of technological advancement where there's new irrigation techniques, increasing the amount of farmland, but you've also got some infrastructure in place, being able to take these truck farms, right? The farms could grow their crops and truck them into an area. And that's coming up with some legislative pieces like the Homestead Act of 1862, which is promoting settlement into the Great Plains into places like our own Kansas City. But it soon became pretty obvious that the city was the focus of the future. It became the focus of progressive politics and this new mass consumer society that went along with it. There was about 4.7 million residents in 1910 in New York City, and it was the largest city in the world. It served as the symbol of modern society. There were stark divisions between the rich and the poor. I think this photograph is a pretty interesting illustration of it. That you can really see the different phases of life and people in different socioeconomic classes and what their business and operational life is like. Uh, the Lower East Side, was newly arrived immigrants on the Lower East Side. They didn't have electricity or indoor toilets. But then you get up to Fifth Avenue, which is not this picture. This is close to the Lower East Side here. But you get up to Fifth Avenue and you've got like mansions and millionaires up in Millionaires Row. So point B. By 1900, every major city had at least one art gallery. Now, Kansas City in 1900 wasn't a huge town, but it wasn't, Kansas City and sometimes have a inferiority complex about our city, I think unfairly, but it didn't have a major art gallery until about 1915 when the Nelson Atkins Museum was started. It was Nelson and Atkins died. They both left money for an art gallery and built what is, and I say this without understatement, one of the finest art galleries in the United States. But art galleries in every city were becoming so common, and libraries were so common that they were raising the cultural standards of the cities. And in fact, they were often referred to as the poor man's university, that a person who wanted to apply themselves and learn about the greats could do it. European abstract art was coming out at the same time. This, and a lot of Americans had a hard time relating to abstract art. We'll talk more about that in a future class. But in American art was developing. You had the Hudson River School. The Hudson River School was like the Hudson River of New York. These are like idyllic scenes through the 19th century. Through the 1800s, there was this real emphasis on nature and beauty and God's creation, and that's awesome. By the turn of the 20th century, though, people were moving out of the country and into the cities, and were looking for art that they could relate to a little bit closer. And that's where you see the development of the Ashcan School, which would show urban scenes like crowded bars and theaters and soaring skyscrapers and electric lights. It was a gritty, no-frill styles of art that showed the urban side of living that a lot of people kind of wanted to overlook, but could identify with pretty fast. I want to introduce you to a few writers of the era. Writers of the era, nonfiction and fiction together, were often referred to by a title known as muckrakers, and we'll use that term a few more times. Muckraking, in its simplest understanding, is like investigative journalism that would go and find the stories that other people don't want to be told. The great example of it up here is Ida Tarbell, whom in a previous class I had confused in my head with Ida B. Wells. They're not the same person. Got my Idas mixed up. But anyway, there's Ida M. Tarbell, and she had written this big expose of John D. Rockefeller in the Standard Oil Company. It was called The History of Standard Oil Company. And it was a monthly serial column in the magazine, which eventually became a book. This guy down here in the bottom left corner, that's Lincoln Steffens. He wrote his book called The Shame of the Cities in 1901. It was published in McClure's magazine also, but it was later published as a book. And in Shame of the Cities, Lincoln Steffens went through and just talked about, like, here's how people are living, and this is how the subhuman conditions of people in crowded tenements, in poor sanitation, in terrible jobs, in unsafe conditions, in fire traps and mold traps, and all of the shame of the cities that we expect Americans to live like that. That's Lincoln Steffens of 1901. But by far the most influential novelist, who was not a journalist. It was this smarmy-looking man here next to me in the bottom right corner. His name is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair wrote a novel called The Jungle, and a lot of people think of it as journalism. It's not. It's a novel, and if you read it, it's pretty clear that it's a novel. It was about a guy who was a Lithuanian immigrant who moved to Chicago and got screwed by the system, basically. He's exploited by business deals and mistreated by employers, and he was laboring in unsafe conditions to produce ultimately unsafe food, which is what people remember the book. Upton Sinclair's goal was to inspire a socialist revolution. He was a socialist and wanted to get people upset about the system and inspired to go work for the fair treatment of people. It didn't really go that way. In the most salacious scene of The Jungle, they're talking about some inferior conditions of a meat packing plant where, I don't know, there's just rotten meat going around everywhere. And there's this big story that they're rendering down the fat to make soap. And a guy fell in the tank and got rendered and was basically dissolved and turned into dish soap. And people have gone back. The Jungle is not a nonfiction story. It's total fiction, and it's actually not that good of a book. You can read it. I've read it. It's fine, but it's not that. It's not a nonfiction book. And he'd said that all of the stories in there were totally plausible in his own investigation into meatpacking plants. He says that he did exaggerate that scene, but that's the only scene that people know. Later, Upton Sinclair quipped that he wanted to hit people in the heart and inspire a socialist revolution. He hit people in the stomach and inspired the Clean Food and Drug and Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which is probably a good thing too. Subpoint D. I want to talk about a little bit of consumer activity here. In 1890, the first shopping center opened in Cleveland. It was known as the Arcade, and the Arcade gets its name not because it had video games in it, but because of this style of roof up here, these arcs all the way down, these arches. That style of building was called an arcade, but it was basically the world's first shopping mall, and that opened in Cleveland in 1890. In 1865, a bit before then, Marshall Field opened the first department store in the city of Chicago. Now, Marshall Field found that women were much better shoppers than men, and if he could just lay on the customer service towards women, he would turn into lifelong customers. The motto of the store was "Give the lady what she wants." And Marshall Fields also pioneered what became known as the bargain basement, which was cheap but reliable goods. So upstairs was fancy department store, downstairs was, I don't know, discount store. And it also comes about at the time that you're starting to see the development of a chain store where the same kind of store, stocking the same merchandise and the same method, would be in several locations in one city or in several cities across the country. Those chain stores offer the same merchandise under the same owners for less than locally owned stores because they could buy in quantity and limit personal service. The most famous of these was the 1870s Woolworth stores, which was started by F.W. Woolworth, discovered that customers would impulse buy super cheap goods. So he developed, like when you're in the shopping line and you're waiting to go check out and you're standing there in front of the gum and you're just standing there in front of the gum and you think, boy, I sure could use a pack of gum. That's Woolworth that came up with that idea that if you just price something cheaply and set it in front of them, people will impulse buy it, even if they don't really want gum. By 1911, Woolworth chain had 596 stores and was doing $1 million in sales every week. In 1872, Ward's catalog was a single sheet of paper. Ward's catalog was a single sheet of paper. Here's the, that's Sears and Roebuck. Is this Ward's? I forget, it doesn't matter. Here's the catalog later. In 1872, Ward's catalog was a single sheet of paper. Richard Sears, a couple of years later, did the same thing with the Sears Roebuck Company. So Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck, they brought catalogs to bring goods to small towns. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, businesses were spending $10 million in advertising. By 1900, so by the end of the century, they were spending $95 million in advertising. The biggest spenders were things like patent medicines and soaps and baking powders. There was ads in magazines and billboards on the sides of buildings. All of these basically were made possible by rural delivery, which is the United States Mail would run routes clear out into the boonies, places that other delivery services wouldn't go, but the United States Post Office would go there into the rural route deliveries. All of these are some of the famous ads. Every time social studies teachers look for ads of this era, you find this one. I have seen it on so many history teachers' documents. I'm not sure it's a real ad. It's got all my fake news buttons popping on there, but I'll include it because everybody includes it. Traditional gender roles were trading dramatically as more and more women were working for wages. The working woman became a symbol of female emancipation, particularly for immigrant women. The idea that women could go to work and earn money and not be dependent on the system or their men to go take care of them. And to that, we turn to this woman in the bottom left corner. Her name is Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and she claimed that the road to women's freedom lay through the workplace, and that what emancipated women, what really gave them social freedom, was the ability to go out and earn their own money. It brought a spirit of personal independence. While we're talking about earning money, let's talk about this guy in the bottom left corner. That is Henry Ford. Henry Ford focused on standardizing output and lowering prices. Now, a lot of people think that Henry Ford invented the automobile. That's not actually true. Like most technological developments, inventing the automobile took place in a lot of places with a lot of people doing small things to advance like the idea of cars. But Henry Ford revolutionized the manufacture of automobiles, and that's really thing to his credit. He was in Chicago watching a butcher's trolley. So basically, he's like watching the Chicago meat packing plants, like Upton Sinclair was writing about. And he noticed that all the workers stood in one place while the meat came to them, and then they cut off their particular cuts of meat along the way. And he said, "Boy, it sure would be neat if car manufacturer worked like that before." Because he didn't invent the car. There was other people making cars, but one person would make an entire vehicle, or they would have crews of people working on big sections, and it was a really slow and time-consuming process where they're basically making one car at a time. It was the the manufacturing line that we associate with Henry Ford. Now, his most famous car was the Ford Model T. It was a simple, lightweight, sturdy vehicle that was strong enough to navigate America's poor roads, because we're not talking about a lot of paved land here yet. It was originally available in several colors, but it didn't stay that way long. Ford found that he could produce the cars faster if he just painted them all the same color. So the famous line was, "You can get it in any color you want, as long as it's black." They also found out that black cured the fastest in the sun. So they would make the car and then roll it outside, and then the paint would cure the fastest as long as it was black. Now, the repetitive, boring work is terrible of an assembly line. You're just standing there and the car comes to you and you do the same thing over and over and over again. And a lot of workers were like, man, this is terrible, and they were quitting. So Henry Ford decided to do something. It was a total zag moment here, that he said he was going to pay his workers so much money that they wouldn't want to quit. He was paying $5 a day, which was a handsome, handsome amount of money back then. It also gave the side benefit that they could even afford to buy the cars they were making. He was a real industry leader in terms of pay for workers. Now, Henry Ford is a mixed bag. In a lot of ways, he was not a really good employer, and we'll probably learn more about those over time. But he was really one of the first ones to jump up wages for manufacturers. Roman numeral number 2. Here we're going to make a shift into kind of a philosophy of life that became known as progressivism. Progressivism was similar to populism from our last unit. Populism was all about like elevating the working class, in particular the farming class. It was a very rural focused. It was a how do you maximize the power of people on the margins? Progressivism is not exactly like that. It's not so much focused on the margins, although it does purport to help them. Progressivism is largely about the middle class and the upper class being the vanguard of the new movement. And it has some other important differences and characteristics that we'll talk about it here. Broadly speaking, the progressive movement had essentially 4 goals to it. Although some of these things don't seem to make sense, or like they're all that compatible of goals, and some people emphasized some more than others. But basically, the goal was to protect the social welfare. In particular, progressivism focused in the urban areas and the people, the immigrants, the people on the margins there. And it would want to promote moral improvement, trying to make overall the country a better place. And I don't think anybody objects to that, although maybe you might object to some of the pieces, in particular the progressive movement. It wanted to create economic reform. And this was a time in American history that it seemed like economic reform was quite overdue. And it also wanted to foster efficiency. And that's the part that almost doesn't seem to make sense. Like, why do you care about efficiency? But it's also worth remembering that progressivism was kind of a scientific movement. These were people that felt like they were freed from the fetters of the old traditionalism of American history, and they wanted to bring that scientific approach into making the world a better place. And to that end, we meet Frederick W. Taylor. Frederick W. Taylor is the guy here in the center. He pioneered an idea known as scientific management, where he would take these time and motion studies to break down tasks into simple and repetitive parts. Frederick W. Taylor said that if people wanted to have the best working conditions, then they would have the easiest job. He was quite obsessed with this idea of breaking down all the pieces into their simplest pieces. I think in spirit we would like that. In reality, what it turned out was that people ended up with these boring and repetitive machine-like work. It actually ended up dehumanizing work in the effort of trying to do it. It wasn't just this kind of work that seemed repetitive, though. White-collar workers also felt a certain loss of freedom. They were earning higher wages than manual workers, but, sitting at a desk and hard-punching calculations all day often felt just as dull and mechanical as mechanical work. Even white-collar jobs didn't seem like they were particularly awesome. This guy in the top right corner, his name is Louis Brandeis. Does he figure in this piece? We will meet Brandeis a little bit later. I'm not sure why he's in this slide. Interesting guy. Hang on to him. Brandeis University was named after him. Later Chief Justice, or I don't think it was Chief Justice. He was on the Supreme Court. Let's go to subpoint C and meet is not, I guess, I was going to say our new friend, but we met him last unit, so he's our old friend, Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs was the guy that was the socialist. He was the guy that led the Pullman strike. And in 1893, there was this economic panic which prompted doubts about capitalism. It felt like maybe in the face of an economic panic that capitalism itself had maybe run its course. Americans were fed up with the economic system, particularly workers, and a lot of them became socialist. And in 1901, labor leader Eugene V. Debs organized the Socialist Party. Now, today, socialism doesn't get a lot of traction in American politics. Even, the Bernie Sanders supporters of the world, I think, look at socialism and put a lot of qualifiers on what it means to be a socialist. In the early 1900s, it seemed a lot more promising to promote socialism, and part of that was because we hadn't really seen it play out like it will play out in other parts of the world. Today, Americans are fairly skeptical of socialism, at least unfettered, uncontrolled, reaches its own ends socialism. But Eugene V. Debs hadn't seen any of that part, and a lot of Americans were really supporting the idea. The Socialist Party was a legitimate political party which brought together the surviving late 19th century radicals and even ran for president in 1912 on the socialist ticket. Now, that was after he had been arrested for social unrest. He ran for president. He would do that a few more times. Subpoint D. Samuel Gompers, whom we met in our last unit, he was the guy that founded the American Federation of Labor. He sought to forge closer ties with other forward-looking corporate leaders. So Samuel Gompers was kind of a moderate, I think we could say then, because he really did want to work with employers and try to create good working conditions, and he sought to forge ties with other forward-looking corporate leaders who wanted to deal with unions as a way to stabilize employee relationships. It was good. In the long run, the AFL was a successfully run organization. Industrial leaders tended to prefer the American Federation of Labor's moderate policies to other groups, and that's where we meet the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. This was also a labor union. And here it was a broad across all, it was kind of like the old Knights of Labor. They would unite anybody who wanted to go join the IWW. They're also known as the Wobblies. I don't know why. But the IWW, the Wobblies, was organized by a group of radical unions and socialists and were not the centrist moderates of Gompers and the AFL. These guys were more Debsian-style socialists and were a lot more organized to rouse rabble. Now, the IWW was also a lot more inclusive than the American Federation of Labor was. It included people like African Americans. While we're talking about people growing into the public sphere, let's talk about new feminism. We might call this first wave feminism. And there are some really notable people on this page. This is also the page that takes up the largest portion of your notes. Well, we'll get there when we talk about Sanger. Let's begin with this woman in the top left corner. Her name is Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman is a fascinating person. She is a fascinating person. She was an anarchist and a lecturer. Now, we don't have a lot of support for anarchy today. That anarchy is not a political movement in the United States. It's a political movement on Reddit, but that doesn't really count. Anyway, Emma Goldman was an anarchist and a lecturer. She really thought that the best treatment for humans in society was to get rid of government altogether and just let everyone fend for themselves, but more importantly, to not have the government overrun your life for you. Today, we might call this the libertarian movement, but it's not exactly there. We'll get to the libertarian movement when we get, I don't know, in a period 8 maybe. Emma Goldman was an anarchist and a lecturer. She traveled the country to speak at rallies on things like sexual freedom and access to birth control, but also political freedom and economic anarchy. She was arrested around 40 times on obscenity charges because of the nature of her talks was oftentimes pretty off-putting to people of the era, although a lot of those arrests were just to simply keep her from appearing, even before she even committed any obscenities. They were just arrested to keep her from being known. She was also one of those people that was pretty comfortable being in the controversy and kind of liked to piss people off. And then let's meet Margaret Sanger, the person here on the bottom part of this screen. Margaret Sanger, it's fitting today that we talk about her. I wish that I could be in class, but I'll be up in Topeka protesting actually against the work of Margaret Sanger. You don't have to take my opinion on this. I'm firmly convinced there is a right perspective on Sanger's work, but I want you to reach it on your own. You're welcome to do your own research. To that end, I've provided to you in your notes. Really, it's been cut for length, but unedited full text pieces of her work and given you the links to go read them for yourselves on neutral, non-ideological websites so you can read it in full text. But let's talk about Margaret Sanger here. Margaret Sanger placed the issue of birth control at the heart of new feminism. In 1921, Margaret Sanger founded an organization known as the American Birth Control League. The goals of the League were spelled out in several of Sanger's books. The first one we'll talk about was her 1920 work, Woman and the New Race, where Sanger explained that there were undesirable immigrants who should basically be kept from overwhelming the native-born white peoples of America. And the country needed a constructive way to promote the better races, which was thinly, not even thinly veiled, not even veiled. The better races were white people and everybody else was not. In 1922, her follow-up hit was called The Pivot of Civilization, and here she argued that the specific goal of the American Birth Control League was to create a race of well-born children by limiting reckless breeding, especially among people who have genetic tendencies to crime. It was kind of a social Darwinist ethic that believed that people were just going to be born criminals, and so you needed to stop the reckless breeding, particularly among people who have genetic tendencies to crime, mental and physical defects, and to ensure racial progress through a process known as eugenics, which was basically forced birth control, which would control the number of problematic people by controlling the number of problematic people. Today, the American Birth Control League has a new name, a much more common name called Planned Parenthood, with 78% of its clinics in or within walking distance of minority neighborhoods. And there it provides black women with 29.7 abortions per 1,000 compared with 8 for white women. It's as if everything that Margaret Sanger wanted to come true comes true. Anyways, this is a really sad place to save and close your notes, but Jesus saves, and so should you.